I call this story My Favorite Aunt. And it's a story that's fun to tell, but it's also a story about why storytelling is important to me. When I was a little boy, my favorite aunt was Aunt Mary. She really shouldn't have been. She lived a long, long way from our home in Talladega, Alabama, and I had another perfectly good aunt, Aunt Margaret, who lived just a mile away from our house. And Aunt Margaret and Uncle Julian had one of the only private swimming pools I knew of in Talladega, Alabama, right in their backyard. Every late spring, they would fill that pool up with spring water from underneath the ground, and we would be there when it got filled up, and we would stick our toes in it, and then we'd leave because it was so cold. But their swimming pool was solar heated. That meant it was out in the sunshine, and eventually those hot Alabama days would warm that water up, and my sisters and I and my friends and I would spend hours and hours at Aunt Margaret and Uncle Julian's pool swimming every summer when I was growing up. So you might think Aunt Margaret should have been my favorite aunt. But for some reason, she just wasn't. I loved Aunt Margaret, but I don't know, it was like her idea of a good Christmas present for a little boy was underpants. No, Aunt Mary was my favorite aunt, even though she lived all the way across the United States in a place called La Jolla, California. Oh, it seemed so exotic to me. They didn't even pronounce J the way we did in Talladega. And I was an expert in pronouncing J because my last name is Jones. Aunt Mary's idea of a good Christmas gift for a little boy was a subscription to Walt Disney Comics. Once a month, a comic book would come in the mail with my name on it and Uncle Scrooge on the cover, and it had 3 stories in it. One story with Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck, and then another story in the middle that might be about anything, and in the end, a Mickey Mouse cereal. Mickey Mouse would get in some terrible trouble with Black Pete, and I would have to wait a whole month to see how he got out of it. I loved that. And I loved Aunt Mary for sending me that every year for Christmas. And Aunt Mary taught me the importance of writing letters. Even before I could write cursive, I would print out letters to Aunt Mary, "Dear Aunt Mary," and I would tell her all the exciting things I'd done that day, like, "Today I played with Walter Odie." And then I would sign it, "Love, Bill, XXXOOO." And about 2 weeks later, I would get a letter back from Aunt Mary. I always recognized her scrawling handwriting. And she would say, "Dear Bill," and she'd tell me all the things she'd been doing, and then she would sign it, "Lots of love, Aunt Mary, XXXOOO." And then she would put inside a dollar bill. So I would write her back again. I was learning the importance of writing letters. Every now and then, Aunt Mary would make the long trip from California back to the family home in Talladega. 2 of her brothers lived there, my father, George, and her brother, Turner, and her sister, Margaret, lived there, and her mother, my grandmama, Nanny. Nanny had cancer, and every now and then, Aunt Mary would come home to help her brothers and her sister take care of Nanny, and she would spend a month or 2 in Talladega. You could hear Aunt Mary coming before she walked in the room. She wore all these bracelets and necklaces, turquoise Indian bracelets, and jade bracelets from Chinatown. You could hear her rattling as she walked in the room, and she wore these exotic clothes, blouses with puffy shoulders and stripes of red and yellow and pink and green and blue, and wide skirts with the same kinds of stripes on them. It was as if a parrot had flown into Talladega, a place where mockingbirds and sparrows lived. And Aunt Mary would tell us about all of the things that she did in her home in California. She would tell us about how the actor Lou Ayres lived just around the corner from her. And she would tell us about the party she went to recently where she met Gregory Peck. And she would tell us about her very, very good friend Josie Wayne, who was John Wayne's ex-wife. When one of their sons was getting married, Aunt Mary was not just invited to the wedding, she was invited to spend the weekend at Josie Wayne's home. She says she walked up the front walk with her little suitcase and rang the doorbell, and this tall, familiar-looking man opened the door and looked down at her and said, "You must be Mary Riley." She says she looked up at him and said, "You must be John Wayne," and just walked in. Not that impressed, because after all, she knew all about him from his ex-wife. One time when Aunt Mary was home in Talladega, I couldn't have been more than 6 years old, because that's about the time that Nanny actually died. And Aunt Mary was there to help take care of Nanny. She let me taste her favorite drink, coffee. I remember being in Nanny's kitchen with Aunt Mary one morning, and she was making herself some coffee, and she poured a little bit in a mug for me and filled it up with milk and stirred in a little sugar and gave it to me to taste. And as I tasted it, I remember Aunt Mary saying, "Let's not tell your father about this." Oh, she was my favorite aunt. Even after Nanny died, Aunt Mary still would come home to Talladega to see her family from time to time. But when I was 13 years old, my father announced that I was finally old enough, and the family was going to drive across the country and see Aunt Mary in her home in California. We planned the trip to California, all the things we were going to see on the way out, the Grand Canyon and Carlsbad Caverns, and then the things we would see when we got to California, like Disneyland. But I said to my father, what I wanted to see more than anything else on our trip to California was my childhood hero, Jerry Lewis. My father said he wasn't sure we could do that. California, he said, was a pretty big state. But when we got there, we discovered that as big as it wasn't too big for Aunt Mary. She showed us almost everything. We even went down to Tijuana, Mexico, and we went up to Yosemite National Park. We went to San Francisco. We went to Disneyland. We went to Hollywood. We took one of those bus rides through Hollywood where they show you the stars' homes, and oh, I was looking so hard for Jerry Lewis. We even pulled up by Jerry Lewis's house, and I was looking so hard out the window that if he had been there, I probably couldn't have seen him because I'd fogged the window up. But he wasn't there, and I didn't see him. Aunt Mary gave us the grand tour of California, and when we got back to her home in La Jolla, she was going through the mail that had come while we'd been gone, and she said, "They're here." And my parents came and opened an envelope, and inside were 3 tickets to the Greek Theater in Los Angeles to see Jerry Lewis live. And so it was that near the end of our trip, my mama and Aunt Mary and I sat on the 11th row in this huge outdoor theater for 2 hours, and I got to watch my hero perform. Oh, Aunt Mary was my favorite aunt. Now, some years later, when I announced that I was going to get married, word came back to the family from California that Aunt Mary was sorry, but she was not going to be able to make the trip home that summer. At first I was disappointed, but then I realized, this is an opportunity. Now I know where we will honeymoon. And so after Lyda and I got married, we drove across the country and honeymooned all the way out to California, and then Aunt Mary gave us California again, just like she had when I was 13 years old. Only this time she said, be sure and bring your formal clothes, because she had us tickets to the Jewel Ball, an annual event in La Jolla. We danced under the stars with all sorts of beautifully dressed people while Bob Crosby and the Bobcats played the music. And of course we went to Disneyland and all the other places that Aunt Mary had to take us. While we were there, she gave us one whole end of her house. She never came back to that end of the house the whole time we were honeymooning there, except once or twice. And when she did, before she came back there, she started slamming doors and stomping around and announcing in a loud voice, well, I've got to come back here for something, so that by the time she got there, we were prepared for her. She was a great hostess for our honeymoon. Now that we were good and married, I started dreaming of the time when we would have children of our own and I could take them across the country to see Aunt Mary. Then we had children, and I realized why my father waited until I was 13 years old to take that trip. No, I decided we need to go ahead and see Aunt Mary, and we need to fly. So in 1980, when Jeff was about 8 or 9 years old and Christopher was about 6, we got in a plane and we flew to San Diego, California, where Aunt Mary met us, and we loaded our suitcases in the back of her car, and we got in her car, and she started to drive us home from the airport on the great interstate highway system of Southern California. Our 2 sons were sitting in the back seat. They had both been to Six Flags over Georgia several times. They fancied themselves afraid of no ride that could be invented by a human being. They both would stand on tiptoes to prove that they were tall enough to ride on the scariest rides ever invented. But sitting in the back seat of Aunt Mary's car, it was as if all the blood left their faces, and their eyes got big as saucers. Aunt Mary peered through the steering wheel just over the dashboard of her car, never looked to the left, never looked to the right, never checked the rearview mirror, turned this way and that, changed lanes. All around us, we heard tires squealing, horns honking. By the time we got to her house, my wife was looking at me with a look that I had long since learned to interpret. It was a look that said, you have to do something about this. So I said to Aunt Mary, how would it be if while we're here, I drove? And she said, oh, that would be wonderful. And we all sighed a sigh of relief. After we'd unloaded the suitcases from the car, the boys were anxious to see the Pacific Ocean, and she said she would ride with us to show us where there was a safe beach. We parked, and as she stepped out of the car, she fell over the curb. She bumped her shin, and blood went everywhere. It didn't look like a serious fall to me, but when I looked at her skin, it was like tissue paper. It was so thin. We spent the rest of that week trying to take care of Aunt Mary while she tried to take care of us. And when we flew home at the end of the week, I realized that my favorite aunt had gotten old. Actually, my father told me that when Aunt Mary was a little girl, the doctors told the family that she was so sickly she probably would not live past her teenage years. But she did, and she became old. And my father and his brother Leon, her only living siblings now, realized that she couldn't live in California by herself any longer, and they began to make plans to move her closer to family. That meant either Talladega or Memphis, where Uncle Leon lived. And there weren't many good options for someone who needed a lot of care in Talladega, and so they decided to move Aunt Mary to a nursing home in Memphis. Now, as it turned out, my family and I were living in Johnson City, Tennessee. Now, that's 500 miles away from Memphis, but there was a church in Memphis that was in the process of asking me to come be their pastor. And so it turned out that Aunt Mary moved into a nursing home in Memphis 2 weeks before we moved to Memphis. And it also turns out that Uncle Leon picked out a nursing home that was just 5 minutes away from where we lived. So when we got there, one of the first things we wanted to do was go see Aunt Mary. We walked into the nursing home and looked down the hall, and there she was, standing at the far end of the hall. She had a walker in her hands. We called to her. She looked up and saw us. She hoisted that walker up off the floor and started practically running down that hall toward us. That walker never touched the floor. Her doctor told her she had to take it with her everywhere she went, so she did. When she got to us down at the end of the hall, she said, "Where am I? Where have they put me? Get me out of here." Aunt Mary eventually outlived both my father and Uncle Leon, as well as all of her other brothers and sisters. My wife and I visited her in the hospital almost every week for 7 years. And what we came to realize was all of the good nurses and attendants who were taking care of her in that nursing home did not know her story. They only knew her as one more elderly person who needed more care than they could possibly give her. And so whenever we visited, I started telling stories to Aunt Mary in front of the nurses, stories about Josie Wayne, remembering her giving me coffee to drink when I was a little boy, remembering our trip out west when I was 13, so that those nurses would get some idea of who this person was through these stories. Finally, Aunt Mary died. The plan was to take her back to Talladega and bury her in the old part of the cemetery right beside her mama and daddy. The minister at First Presbyterian Church was going to do the service, but had never met Aunt Mary, and so I asked if I could come and help. As we were driving to the cemetery, I found myself wondering if anybody would really be there. There were a few cousins left, but Aunt Mary had outlived so many of her friends. When we got to the graveside, though, there was a big crowd there. A lot of elderly people who remembered Aunt Mary, but then a lot of people more like my age. Not just my cousins, but people I wasn't even aware of who they were. I told some of these stories about Aunt Mary, and when the service was over, several of those people came up to me and said, we remember your Aunt Mary. We got letters with dollar bills in them, too." And that's when I realized that Aunt Mary was not just my favorite aunt. She was a favorite of people to whom she was not even related.